The last photograph they took was not dramatic. No storm breaking across the ridge, no visible fear, no sign that anything was wrong. Just 9 young hikers standing in the snow beneath a pale, endless sky. Their faces wind-burned, their jackets stiff with frost. Someone mid-laugh, someone looking away from the camera. If you didn't know what came next, you would think this was the beginning. It was the end. And that is what makes the image difficult to look at, because nothing in it warns you. In late January of 1959, 9 experienced ski hikers began an expedition into the northern Ural Mountains of the former Soviet Union. Their goal was a remote peak called Otorten. The name, translated loosely from the local Mansi language, means, "Don't go there." They went anyway, not because they were reckless, because they were capable. The group was led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a skilled engineering student from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. The others were similarly trained, certified, experienced in winter expeditions. This was classified as a Category 3 trek, the highest difficulty rating available. These were not thrill seekers. They were disciplined. They prepared carefully, logged equipment, documented route plans, notified authorities of expected return dates. They expected hardship. They did not expect mystery. They traveled by train, then by truck, then on skis. Civilization thinned behind them. Diaries later recovered would describe songs sung in cold rail cars, jokes about frozen bread, photographs of clumsy falls in deep snow. Ordinary discomfort. Ordinary optimism.
Nothing in those entries suggested tension. Nothing foreshadowed fear. On February 1st, worsening weather forced them slightly off course. Snow thickened. Wind rose. Visibility narrowed. Rather than retreat into the forest below, they chose to camp high on the exposed eastern slope of a mountain called Kholat Siak. Its name translates to Mountain of the Dead. The name predates the hikers, predates the Soviet Union, predates explanation. But names do not cause harm. Weather does. They anchored their tent into the snow, placed skis beneath it for insulation, organized boots near the entrance, hung outerwear carefully. Experienced behavior. Controlled. Measured. Then, sometime in the dark hours between February 1st and February 2nd, something changed. When search teams finally reached the site weeks later, the first thing they noticed was not destruction.
It was stillness. The tent remained partially upright. Snow had drifted against it, but it had not collapsed under avalanche debris. And then they saw the cuts. The canvas had been slashed open from the inside, not torn by wind, not ripped by external force. Cut. Clean, deliberate openings made by knives. Who cuts their way out of their own shelter in sub-zero temperatures? Outside the tent, footprints descended the slope toward the forest nearly a mile away. 9 distinct sets, some barefoot, some wearing only socks. They were not chaotic. They were aligned, as if the group left together, as if they believed they would return shortly. That detail matters, because panic scatters people. This did not. Beneath a tall cedar tree at the forest's edge, investigators found the remains of a small fire. Branches had been broken high above ground level, suggesting at least one of them climbed the tree.
To look for the tent. To look for something else. 2 bodies were found near that cedar. Underdressed for the cold, shoeless, frozen. Between the cedar and the tent, 3 more bodies were discovered, positioned as if attempting to move uphill, back toward shelter. They did not make it. Months later, after snowmelt exposed deeper terrain, the remaining 4 hikers were found in a ravine farther into the woods. They were buried under meters of compacted snow, and some of their injuries were not consistent with simple hypothermia. Severe chest trauma, a skull fracture, soft tissue damage. One victim was missing her tongue. There were no clear signs of external attack, no defensive wounds, no foreign footprints in the area, no confirmed evidence of conflict within the group. Cold explains many things, but not this. The official investigation concluded in May 1959. The cause of death was recorded with unsettling restraint, an unknown compelling force.
The case was closed. Files were archived, access restricted, and for decades, explanations stalled. What makes this story endure is not only the injuries, it is the decision. 9 capable hikers, a stable tent, supplies inside, temperatures approaching -30 degrees Celsius. They cut their way out, left boots behind, left coats behind, stepped into darkness. Together. That behavior resists easy explanation. Over the years, theories accumulated. Avalanche, military testing, infrasound-induced panic, secret experimental weapons, parachute mines, whispers of something not entirely understood. We will examine them, slowly. But before speculation, there were parents. There were letters that stopped arriving.
There were classmates who waited at train platforms that never filled. There were ordinary lives interrupted by a silence that did not resolve. The final photographs recovered from their cameras show small human moments. A gloved hand adjusting a ski pole, a cricket smile, snow blown sideways across a lens. In one blurred frame, a dark figure stands.
The mountain did not offer explanation. Wind erased edges. Snow softened timelines. Archives sealed the rest. And yet, something about 9 experienced people leaving safety in an orderly line into lethal cold feels unfinished, like a sentence interrupted. Tonight, we begin on that slope, inside the tent, with wind pressing against canvas, and the moment just before they chose the dark. We will not rush this, because sometimes the most unsettling part of a mystery is not what happened, but the decision to step outside.
Before we ask what happened on that mountain, we have to sit with something more uncomfortable. Not the injuries, not the missing tongue, not the sealed files. The decision, because everything begins there. 9 experienced hikers were inside a secure tent. Wind outside, darkness pressing against canvas, temperatures dropping toward -30 degrees Celsius, and they cut their way out, from the inside. That detail has never changed. Even decades later, when the case was reopened and re-examined, investigators confirmed what the first search team saw in 1959. The fabric was sliced outward. Not clawed, not blown apart, not collapsed under catastrophic avalanche pressure. Cut. Which means the danger, whatever it was, felt immediate enough to bypass the entrance. You do not slash your own shelter unless the exit feels too slow. So what makes 9 disciplined hikers abandon warmth for exposure? Let's remove the sensational explanations for a moment. No secret weapons, no creatures in the snow. Just behavior. The footprints told a quiet story. They were not scattered. They were not running. They were descending in a loose line toward the forest. Some barefoot, some in socks, some with a single felt boot. The spacing between steps was consistent. That suggests coordination. That suggests communication, not chaos.
If panic had erupted inside that tent, if something violent had broken in, we would expect erratic tracks, staggering patterns, signs of struggle. Instead, the group moved downhill together, which leads to an uncomfortable possibility. They believed leaving the tent was safer than staying. Pause there. Because that reframes everything. The slope of Kolatsiakl is exposed. Wind scours its surface. Snow drifts unevenly. In whiteout conditions, sound behaves strangely. Pressure shifts, vibrations carry. One widely discussed explanation involves avalanche risk.
In 1959, the official Soviet report dismissed avalanche outright. Investigators argued the tent remained partially standing and showed no heavy snow compression consistent with a large slide. For decades, that dismissal hardened into certainty. But more recent modeling, including a 2020 Russian reinvestigation and independent Swiss avalanche simulation research, suggested a small slab avalanche was possible. Not a massive cinematic wave of snow, something subtler. A delayed slab fracture, enough to collapse part of the tent wall, enough to create internal pressure and disorientation, not necessarily enough to bury it completely.
If a slab broke above them and pressed into the tent, Dyatlov may have ordered immediate evacuation to avoid being trapped. That would explain cutting the canvas. It would explain urgency without screaming panic. But it does not explain everything. Because if avalanche danger drove them out, why move nearly a mile downhill before regrouping? Why not shelter closer to the tent? Why leave boots behind? Even under avalanche fear, experienced hikers retrieve essential gear, unless they believe they will return within minutes. Another theory shifts from snow to sound, infrasound. Low-frequency sound waves generated by specific wind patterns across mountain ridges can induce anxiety, nausea, and irrational dread. Some researchers argue the shape of the slope could have produced a rare vortex effect, creating physical discomfort intense enough to trigger group distress.
There is laboratory evidence that infrasound can influence human emotion, but emotion is not compulsion. Would 9 individuals simultaneously abandon shelter without at least one resisting? Would trained hikers not recognize environmental discomfort? The human mind can fracture under pressure, but group psychology is complex. 9 people rarely share identical panic, and yet the footprints remain aligned. There is also the question of light. Several witnesses in nearby regions reported strange orange spheres in the sky during that winter, possibly military flares or distant weapons testing. The northern Urals were not entirely isolated from Soviet defense experimentation at the time. The region lay within reach of test corridors. The Cold War did not pause for hikers. Speculation suggests parachute mines, explosive devices that detonate midair, could have triggered shock waves powerful enough to cause internal injuries without obvious external trauma.
That theory attempts to explain the severe chest compression found in the ravine victims. But again, no blast marks, no burn patterns, no confirmed military debris recovered at the scene. Conspiracy has gravity. It attracts uncertainty. But gravity is not proof. Let's return to the forest. Under the cedar tree, 2 members attempted to build a fire. Bark was stripped, small branches broken. Evidence of survival instinct remained intact. Someone climbed that tree. That matters. Climbing requires intention. It suggests someone was scanning the slope, looking back toward the tent, perhaps checking if it was visible, perhaps searching for movement. Between the cedar and the tent, 3 bodies lay positioned as if returning uphill. Hypothermia does not erase direction immediately. Cognitive impairment under extreme cold follows stages: shivering, confusion, paradoxical undressing, collapse.
The distance between those bodies suggests they were trying to go back, which raises a second uncomfortable possibility. Whatever forced them out may have subsided, and they attempted to correct course. But cold does not forgive hesitation. The 4 found in the ravine present the most debated injuries. Severe chest trauma, equivalent, some experts said, to high-impact car collisions, yet no external lacerations matching blunt force assault. Modern forensic analysis later suggested snow compression within the ravine could have caused crushing injuries over time. If they fell or slid into a snow-covered gully, accumulated snow weight might have collapsed rib cages gradually. Not an explosion, not a fight. Pressure. Quiet, relentless pressure. Still, the missing tongue remains unsettling.
Scavenging animals, decomposition, and water flow within snowmelt streams are the most widely accepted explanations. But emotionally, it resists simplicity. Because humans react strongly to absence, a missing piece invites imagination. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case, narrowing possible causes to avalanche, snow slab movement, or hurricane-force winds. In 2020, the official conclusion reaffirmed avalanche-related dynamics. Case closed. Again. But public certainty did not follow. Because while avalanche can explain evacuation, it does not fully explain prolonged separation. It does not explain why experienced hikers failed to retrieve gear once initial danger passed. And it does not erase the strangeness of that orderly descent into lethal cold. The Dyatlov group did not scatter like prey. They moved like a team executing a plan under pressure. And that is what unsettles, because it suggests leadership.
Deliberation. A decision made collectively. Not hysteria, not chaos. Choice. Even if that choice was shaped by fear. Even if it was made in seconds. On that slope, wind pressed against canvas. Snow shifted. Perhaps a crag formed above them. Perhaps a sound moved through the ridge like distant thunder. Perhaps Dyatlov made a call. Out. Now. And perhaps they believed they would return within minutes. Boots can be retrieved. Coats can be reclaimed. Tents can be repaired. Time can be regained. Unless something interrupts that return. In the next part, we move closer to the ravine. Closer to the injuries. Closer to the point where survival stopped being possible. We are not chasing spectacle. We are tracing behavior. Because if we understand why they stepped into the cold, we may begin to understand why they never stepped back out.
When the first 5 bodies were found, the story felt tragic. Exposure, disorientation, a failed return. It was terrible, but explainable. Then spring began loosening the mountain's grip, and the case changed, because 4 of them were still missing. Search teams returned in May of 1959. Snow that once buried the forest had hardened into layered sheets. Meltwater carved channels beneath the surface. Probing poles struck something deep within a narrow ravine, roughly 75 meters beyond the cedar tree. They dug. What they uncovered did not feel like simple hypothermia. The 4 hikers lay beneath nearly 4 meters of compacted snow. And the injuries told a different story. The ravine did not speak of cold first. It spoke of pressure.
These 4 were better dressed than the others. That detail matters. Some wore clothing that had belonged to the first 2 who died near the cedar. A sweater cut away, trousers reassigned, layering redistributed. Not panic, not frenzy. Decision-making. This tells us something about time. They did not collapse immediately after leaving the tent. They survived long enough to adapt, long enough to evaluate who could still be helped, long enough to choose cooperation over chaos. That behavioral anchor is critical, because whatever happened on that mountain, it did not instantly dissolve them into hysteria. They were still thinking. The ravine itself offered protection the open slope could not. Less wind, tree cover, snowbanks high enough to carve shelter. Investigators noted signs that branches had been cut and laid across part of the ravine, possibly as a base for a snow den. If so, this was not wandering. It was structured survival. But the ravine concealed risk. Overhanging snow accumulates weight. Layers settle. Weak bonds fracture. Snow is not soft when compressed. It behaves like concrete. 3 of the 4 hikers showed severe internal trauma. Crushed ribs, massive chest compression, a skull fracture. Early examiners compared the force required to a car collision. Yet there were no external wounds matching blunt assault, no deep lacerations, no defensive cuts, No foreign footprints in the surrounding snow. Trauma without visible attack unsettles instinct. We expect violence to leave fingerprints. Here, it left pressure. Pause there, because pressure is quieter and harder to narrate. Modern avalanche and snowpack modeling suggests a possibility that does not require explosion or enemy presence. If the hikers dug into the ravine wall to build a snow shelter, the overhanging mass above them could have collapsed during the night, not a cinematic avalanche sweeping a mountainside.
A localized slab failure. Dense, compacted snow dropping downward into confined space. Thousands of pounds pressing into bodies already weakened by cold. Compression injuries can occur without dramatic external tearing. Snow distributes force differently than rock or metal. Air narrows. Ribs bend beyond tolerance. Darkness closes in. Not chaos. Weight. This explanation fits several physical findings, but explanation does not erase unease, because it still leaves the first question unresolved. What drove them from the tent in the first place? One of the ravine victims was missing her tongue and portions of soft tissue. Early accounts amplified this detail into something monstrous. But decomposition beneath snow, combined with meltwater channels and animal scavenging, often removes soft tissue first. Forensic reassessment decades later largely supports environmental causes.
Still, absence feels deliberate to the human mind. We resist randomness. Silence invites narrative. There were also traces of radiation detected on some garments. Low levels, not universal, enough to provoke suspicion. In 1959, the Cold War shaped much of the world's background noise. Members of the group had previously worked in environments where radioactive material was present. Contamination could have predated the hike. The data remains limited, and limited data creates space. But space is not proof. So we return to behavior. Because behavior is harder to exaggerate. Let's reconstruct the likely sequence without spectacle. They leave the tent to avoid perceived immediate danger. They descend toward forest for shelter and orientation. They attempt to build a fire. 2 succumb to exposure. The remaining redistribute clothing. Some attempt to return uphill to the tent. Others move deeper into the ravine to construct protection. Snow shifts. Structure fails. Pressure ends what cold began. There is no singular dramatic event, just incremental vulnerability. And that possibility may be the most unsettling of all, because it removes the villain. No hidden attacker in the trees, no visible adversary. Just environment, time, and the narrowing corridor of survival choices. The official 1959 report concluded that the hikers died due to an unknown compelling force. That phrase lingers. Compelling suggests inevitability, something that overrides preference, something that pushes. Was the compelling force snow dynamics interacting with human urgency? Was it fear amplified by wind and darkness? Was it a cascade of rational decisions that slowly eliminated alternatives? 9 disciplined hikers, layer by layer, choice by choice, until there were none left. Photographs recovered from their cameras show ordinary fatigue, snow glare, a man adjusting bindings, a woman brushing wind from her face. No omen, no cinematic warning, which brings us back to the ravine. It was not dramatic when it happened. If a snow shelf collapsed, it would not have echoed like thunder across the mountain. It would have sounded like a muffled shift, a settling, a final compression, and then stillness. The official report was brief. It listed dates, weather conditions, locations of recovery, and one final conclusion. The hikers died as a result of an unknown compelling force. No suspect, no criminal proceeding, no public trial, just a phrase. Then the file was closed. In 1959, the case did not become a global obsession. It settled quietly inside the bureaucracy of the Soviet Union.
Families received answers that were not answers. Students at the Ural Polytechnic Institute returned to lectures where 9 seats remained permanently empty. Life resumed, on paper, but the mountain did not explain itself, and absence has a long memory. For decades, access to the investigative archive was limited. Pages were missing. Some documents were classified. Others were rumored to exist but unavailable. Secrecy does not create mystery. It amplifies it. By the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, renewed public interest emerged. Journalists revisited the slope. Amateur investigators retraced ski paths. The site itself gained a name it did not originally hold: Dyatlov Pass, a location defined not by geography, but by loss. In 2019, Russian authorities formally reopened the case. They limited the scope of review to natural explanations: avalanche dynamics, snow slab movement, or extreme wind events. In 2020, the official conclusion reaffirmed avalanche-related causes. A slab of snow, destabilized by wind and slope angle, may have collapsed against the tent. The group, fearing burial, evacuated. Subsequent exposure and snowpack collapse in the ravine accounted for the fatalities. On paper, the sequence aligns. Snow physics is real. Hypothermia behavior is documented. Compression injuries can occur without external trauma. The explanation is plausible. And yet, public certainty did not follow. Because mystery is not erased by plausibility alone. It fades when emotional tension dissolves. And here, something lingers.
Part of what lingers is timing. The hikers were experienced. The slope angle where they camped was relatively shallow by avalanche standards. No large-scale debris field was documented at the tent site. Modern simulations suggest that even a small slab release could have been delayed hours after initial cutting into the snowpack. The weight of the tent, combined with wind loading, might have created instability that triggered later. Possible? Not theatrical, but possible. Still, possible does not feel the same as complete. Part of what lingers is human behavior. 9 people left shelter in an orderly line. Some attempted to return. Some constructed protection. Clothing was redistributed. No signs of interpersonal violence. No evidence of betrayal. No indication that fear dissolved cooperation. They remained a group until they could not. That detail shapes how we remember them. Not as victims of something monstrous, but as individuals navigating narrowing options under extreme stress.
Over the years, alternative theories have never fully disappeared. Military tests in remote corridors of the northern Urals, parachute mines detonating midair, unreported weapons experiments, even speculative explanations involving unknown phenomena in the sky. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the mountain yielded none. No debris, no confirmed blast residue, no verifiable documentation connecting military activity to that specific slope on that specific night. What remains strongest is not conspiracy. It is environment. Cold that punishes delay, wind that alters perception, snow that shifts without warning, darkness that reduces certainty to instinct. There is another layer, rarely discussed: survivor psychology without survivors. When a mystery has no living witness, interpretation becomes projection.
We imagine the moment the canvas was cut. We imagine the descent. We imagine the ravine collapsing. But imagination is not memory, and the mountain recorded none of it. What endures instead are fragments, photographs, diary entries, boot prints fading downhill, a tent with slashes in the side. Artifacts, not testimony. In the decades since, hikers have returned to the slope of Kolatsiakl. The wind still moves across it the same way. Snow still accumulates along its ridges. Nothing in the landscape signals what occurred there in 1959. No monument large enough to alter terrain, no scar in the earth. just a name on maps. Dyatlov Pass, a geographic memory. For some, the case is closed. Avalanche plus exposure, a tragic cascade of rational decisions under pressure. For others, the unanswered details continue to provoke doubt. Why cut from the inside so urgently? Why descend so far before regrouping? Why did the initial investigation feel restrained in its language? The tension between rational reconstruction and emotional uncertainty is what keeps the story alive.
Not because it is unsolved in every dimension, but because it resists a single clean narrative. If we remove speculation, what remains is simpler and heavier. 9 young people set out across winter terrain. They prepared carefully. They trusted their training. And one night, conditions shifted beyond their control. Competence met unpredictability. And unpredictability won. There is no villain in that version. No hidden enemy. Just the reminder that nature does not negotiate. That even experience has limits. That sometimes the most dangerous moment is not panic, but the decision made seconds before it. The Dyatlov Pass Incident endures because it sits at the intersection of knowledge and doubt. We understand more about snow science today than investigators did in 1959. We can model wind slabs with computers. We can simulate compression loads. We can reconstruct temperature curves. But we cannot rewind the night. We cannot hear what was said inside the tent. We cannot stand inside that moment of urgency. And so the final image returns. 9 figures beneath a pale sky, unaware of how thin the margin had become. The mountain did not explain itself. It did not need to. Time moved forward. Archives were reopened. Conclusions were issued. But the silence remained. And sometimes, silence is not the absence of answers. It is the echo of decisions made in the dark.